The morning mist hung heavy over the rolling fields of northern France on July 1, 1916. Across a 25-mile front along the river Somme, over 100,000 British soldiers crouched in their trenches, bayonets fixed, watches synchronized, hearts pounding with anticipation. In just hours, they would participate in what their commanders promised would be the breakthrough that would end the Great War. Instead, they were about to endure the bloodiest single day in British military history. Before the sun set that evening, nearly 60,000 British soldiers would become casualties. 20,000 would never see home again. Entire communities would be shattered in a matter of minutes. The flower of Britain's youth, volunteers who had answered their country's call with patriotic fervor, would be cut down in waves across the shell-torn landscape of no man's land. This was not just a military disaster. This was a human catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. The origins of this tragedy stretch back to the winter of 1915, when Allied commanders gathered around polished tables in heated rooms, far from the mud and misery of the Western Front. For 18 months, the war had devolved into a deadly stalemate. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, two vast armies faced each other across a narrow strip of devastated earth, neither able to break through, both bleeding away their strength in futile attacks against wire and machine guns. Something had to be done. The British and French agreed to launch a massive joint offensive in the summer of 1916. The location was chosen not for tactical advantage, but for convenience. The Somme region was where British and French forces met on the Western Front. It seemed as good a place as any to attempt the great breakthrough that would restore movement to the war. Originally, this was to be a French-led operation, with the British playing a supporting role, but fate intervened in February 1916 when the Germans launched their own massive assault against the fortress city of Verdun. The French found themselves locked in a death struggle that would consume their reserves and attention. The burden of the Somme offensive fell to the British, transforming their supporting role into the lead. This shift in responsibility could not have come at a more challenging time. The British Army of 1916 bore little resemblance to the small professional force that had crossed to France in 1914. That original army, though superbly trained, had been bled white in the opening battles of the war. In its place stood something unprecedented in British history, a mass citizen army of volunteers. At the outbreak of war, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener had launched a recruiting campaign that captured the imagination of the nation. His famous poster, depicting his stern face and pointing finger above the words, "Your country needs you," became an icon of the age. Young men flocked to recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed the system. They came from every walk of life: clerks and farmers, students and factory workers, the fittest and most enthusiastic of Britain's youth. These were not professional soldiers. They were ordinary men, animated by extraordinary purpose. They believed they were fighting for civilization itself, for the rights of small nations, for the future of democracy. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their patriotism genuine, their courage unquestionable. But enthusiasm and courage, however admirable, were poor substitutes for experience when facing the killing fields of modern warfare. The volunteers organized themselves in ways that reflected the communities from which they came. Across Britain, entire neighborhoods, factories and sports clubs enlisted together under the promise that they would serve alongside their friends and neighbors. These became known as the Pals Battalions, units bound together not just by military discipline, but by bonds of friendship, kinship, and shared identity. Lord Derby first coined the phrase "Battalion of Pals" when he recruited enough men to form 3 battalions of the King's Liverpool Regiment in just 1 week. The concept spread like wildfire. The stockbrokers of London's financial district formed their own battalion. The footballers of the Heart of Midlothian Club enlisted together. Mill workers from Lancashire, miners from Wales, clerks from Yorkshire, all joined in groups that preserved their civilian identities within military structure. The Accrington Pals epitomized this phenomenon. 700 men from the small Lancashire town and surrounding areas enlisted together, bound by ties that went back generations. They trained together, sailed to France together, and now prepared to fight together. What none of them realized was that they would also die together. By the spring of 1916, these volunteer armies had been training for over a year. They had learned to march in formation, to handle their rifles, to dig trenches and string wire. But they had never faced the reality of modern warfare. They had never experienced the terror of artillery bombardment, the chaos of battle, or the deadly efficiency of German machine guns. Their commanders, products of a different age of warfare, struggled to understand the tactical realities of the Western Front. Many senior officers had cut their teeth in colonial campaigns where British firepower and discipline had proven decisive against less well-equipped opponents. The idea that massed infantry attacks might fail against prepared defenses seemed almost inconceivable to men raised on tales of British military superiority. As summer approached, the British began their preparations for the Great Offensive. The plan, in its essential simplicity, reflected the thinking of an earlier age. A massive artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses, cut the wire, and neutralize enemy guns. Then the infantry would advance across no man's land and occupy the shattered German trenches. From there, they would exploit their breakthrough and roll up the German line. On paper, the plan appeared sound. The British had assembled the largest artillery force in their history. Over 1,500 guns of various calibers were positioned along the front, ready to unleash unprecedented destruction on the German positions. For 7 days, they would pound the enemy lines with over 1.5 million shells. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. The bombardment began on June 24th. For a full week, the thunder of guns rolled across the Somme Valley. The earth shook continuously. Great columns of smoke and debris rose from the German trenches. From the British positions, it appeared that nothing could survive such punishment. Officers peered through periscopes and pronounced themselves satisfied. The German defenses were being obliterated, but appearances deceived. The German army that faced the British in 1916 was not the same force that had marched into Belgium 2 years earlier. It had learned hard lessons about survival on the modern battlefield. When the Germans first reached the Somme region in 1914, they immediately began improving their positions. They dug deep bunkers, some 30 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and steel. They strung dense belts of barbed wire. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. Most importantly, they prepared for exactly the kind of attack the British were planning. When the bombardment began, German soldiers simply descended into their underground shelters and waited. The shells crashed overhead, but the deep bunkers protected them. The wire was damaged in places, but much of it remained intact. The machine gun positions, carefully concealed and protected, survived largely unscathed. As the British guns thundered day after day, the Germans made their own preparations. They cleaned their weapons, checked their ammunition, and waited for the inevitable infantry assault. They knew it was coming. The week-long bombardment announced British intentions as clearly as if they had sent a telegram. When the guns stopped, the attack would begin. The British bombardment, for all its sound and fury, suffered from fundamental flaws that would prove fatal. The guns were spread too thinly across the front to achieve the necessary concentration of fire. Many of the shells were shrapnel rounds, deadly against troops in the open but ineffective against concrete fortifications. Worse still, an estimated 30% of the shells failed to explode, a testament to the hasty production methods of Britain's expanded munitions industry. The French forces operating alongside the British possessed more than 900 heavy guns for their sector. The British, despite their numerical superiority in troops, had barely half that number spread across a much wider front. When General Haig extended his battle plan to include attacks on the German second trench line, he effectively halved the concentration of artillery fire that could fall on the primary targets. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. In terms of shells per yard of enemy trench, the Somme bombardment was actually weaker than previous British attacks. Yet confidence remained high in British headquarters. The volunteers of Kitchener's army stood ready in their trenches, many writing final letters home, sharing cigarettes, and checking their equipment one last time. They had been told that the German defenses were destroyed, that they would face minimal resistance, that this would be their moment of glory. Some units were even ordered to walk across no man's land rather than run. So certain were their commanders that opposition would be negligible. The night of June 30th passed slowly for the men in the trenches. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. The constant rumble of artillery had become the soundtrack of their existence, but now it carried different meaning. Tomorrow, when those guns fell silent, they would climb over the parapet and advance toward an enemy they had never seen but were prepared to die fighting. At dawn on July 1st, 1916, the final phase of the bombardment began. The guns roared with renewed fury as British artillerymen sent their shells screaming toward German positions. Smoke and dust obscured the battlefield. The very earth seemed to convulse under the impact of high explosive. To watching officers, it appeared impossible that anything could survive such devastation. Then, at 7:29 in the morning, an eerie silence fell across the battlefield. The guns had lifted their fire, switching to targets deeper behind German lines. In that moment of quiet, over 100,000 British soldiers prepared for the assault that would define their generation. Officers checked their watches. Whistles were raised to lips. Along 25 miles of front, the flower of British youth prepared to leave their trenches forever. At precisely 7:30, the whistles shrieked. All along the British line, men climbed over the parapet and began walking toward the German positions. They advanced in waves, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining the formations they had practiced on training grounds in England. The early morning sun caught the gleam of their bayonets as they moved across the shell-torn landscape of no man's land. What happened next shattered every assumption upon which the British plan was based. As the sound of the bombardment faded, German soldiers emerged from their deep bunkers like ants from a disturbed nest. They raced to their weapons positions, manning machine guns that had survived the week-long pounding. The carefully planned British advance had given them precious minutes to prepare their reception. The first German machine guns opened fire at 7:31. Then more joined in, creating a deadly chorus that swept across no man's land. The British soldiers, advancing in neat lines as they had been trained, presented perfect targets. Men began falling in windows, cut down by streams of bullets that scythed through their ranks like an invisible reaper. The Accrington Pals, advancing toward the village of Serre, walked directly into this storm of steel. These were men who had grown up together, worked together, and enlisted together in the summer of 1914. Now they died together on the muddy fields of France. Within 20 minutes, 235 were dead and 350 wounded. Of the 700 men who had left their trenches that morning, fewer than 100 remained unscathed. The carnage was repeated all along the British front. The Leeds Pals lost 750 men out of 900. The Sheffield City Battalion was cut to pieces. The Bradford Pals suffered over 1,000 casualties in the first 2 days. Entire communities were being wiped out in a matter of minutes, their young men falling in foreign fields thousands of miles from home. At Thiepval, the Ulster Division launched their attack with characteristic determination. These were men from Ireland's Protestant community, many of whom wore orange sashes into battle in commemoration of the Battle of the Boyne. They advanced singing hymns and war songs, their distinctive accents carrying across no man's land even as German bullets found their marks. The Ulstermen actually reached their objectives, capturing the formidable Schwaben redoubt, but found themselves isolated and unsupported. Without reinforcement, they were forced to withdraw, leaving their dead scattered across the ground they had briefly won. The German defenders, many of whom had been on the Somme since 1914, fought with the desperation of men defending their adopted homeland. They had spent 2 years improving these positions, digging deeper, building stronger, creating killing zones that channeled attacking forces into carefully prepared fire lanes. When the British appeared, walking slowly across open ground in broad daylight, it seemed almost too easy. Machine gunners traversed their weapons back and forth across the advancing waves, watching through their sights as men crumpled and fell. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. British soldiers, who had been told they would face minimal resistance, instead encountered a wall of fire that defied comprehension. German defenders, who had endured a week of bombardment in their underground shelters, now witnessed slaughter on a scale that shocked even hardened veterans. By mid-morning, it was clear that the Great Offensive had failed catastrophically along most of the British front. The neat lines of advancing infantry had dissolved into scattered groups of survivors, seeking whatever cover they could find in shell holes and folds in the ground. Medical personnel, both British and German, began the grim task of tending to the wounded, who lay scattered across no man's land. The only significant British success came in the southern sector, where the 13th and 18th Divisions managed to capture the villages of Montauban and Mametz. Even here, success came at a terrible price, and the gains were far short of what had been planned. The French forces, operating south of the Somme River itself, achieved greater success with fewer casualties, aided by better artillery preparation and the element of surprise that the Germans had not expected attacks in their sector. As the day wore on, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to British commanders. Reports filtered back from the front lines telling of units that had simply vanished, of objectives that remained in German hands, of casualties that mounted beyond all previous experience. The Great Breakthrough had become the greatest single-day catastrophe in British military history. Yet even as the reports of catastrophe reached headquarters, the fighting continued with desperate intensity. German artillery, which had remained silent during the bombardment to avoid counter-battery fire, now opened up with devastating effect. Shells burst among the scattered survivors in no man's land, adding to the carnage that machine guns had already wrought. The carefully planned timetable of the British assault dissolved into chaos as units lost contact with their commanders and each other. In the village of Beaumont-Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment faced annihilation in one of the day's most heartbreaking episodes. These men had traveled thousands of miles from their island home to fight for the Empire, leaving behind fishing villages and lumber camps to serve on the battlefields of Europe. They advanced from a position called Y Ravine, moving uphill toward German positions that commanded perfect fields of fire. The Newfoundlanders walked into a killing ground that had been prepared with methodical German efficiency. Machine guns positioned in the ruins of Beaumont-Hamel village swept the slope with overlapping fire. Artillery observers, safe in their concrete bunkers, called down precise barrages on the advancing men. Within 30 minutes, the regiment had been virtually destroyed. Of the 800 men who left their trenches, only 68 answered roll call the following day. Many families in St. John's would receive multiple telegrams announcing the deaths of fathers and sons who had enlisted together. The human cost of these tactical failures extended far beyond the battlefield itself. In small towns across Britain, entire streets would soon be draped in black as news of the casualties reached home. The Grimsby Chums, drawn from the fishing port on England's east coast, lost half their number in the first assault. The Sheffield City Battalion, composed largely of white-collar workers and clerks, suffered similar devastation. These were not abstract military units, but communities in uniform, bound together by shared experiences and mutual trust. The psychological impact on the German defenders was equally profound, though in different ways. Many had expected the British bombardment to herald a massive assault, but the reality exceeded their worst fears. Machine gunners reported that they wept as they fired, unable to comprehend the scale of slaughter they were inflicting. Some ceased firing altogether, overwhelmed by the sight of British soldiers walking steadily into certain death. German regimental histories from that day describe a mixture of professional satisfaction and human revulsion. The defenders had performed their duty with devastating effectiveness, but many questioned why the British continued to attack in such suicidal formations. Prisoners taken later in the day spoke of their amazement at British courage and their bewilderment at British tactics. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, isolated groups of British soldiers still clung to positions in no man's land. Some had found temporary refuge in shell craters. Others had reached sections of German wire that had been partially cut. A few brave souls even made it to the German front line, only to find themselves outnumbered and cut off from support. These survivors faced an agonizing choice: attempt to return across the killing ground they had just crossed, or surrender to an enemy they had been taught to hate. The medical services, both British and German, struggled to cope with casualties on a scale for which no army had prepared. Stretcher bearers worked under constant fire, carrying wounded men back to aid stations that quickly became overwhelmed. Many of the injured lay where they fell, crying out for water or calling for their mothers as the sun beat down mercilessly. The July heat turned no man's land into a furnace where wounded men faced the additional torment of thirst and exposure. German medical personnel, following the conventions of warfare, treated British wounded when they could reach them safely. In some sectors, unofficial truces developed as both sides recognized the humanitarian necessity of recovering the injured. These moments of compassion provided brief respites from the industrial killing that characterized modern warfare. The failure of the first day's assault sent shockwaves through the British command structure. General Haig, the commander-in-chief, had staked his reputation on the success of the Somme offensive. The preliminary bombardment had consumed vast quantities of shells that had taken months to accumulate. The volunteer armies represented Britain's best hope of achieving decisive victory before the nation's resources were exhausted. Now, instead of breakthrough and exploitation, Haig faced the grim reality of unprecedented casualties for minimal territorial gain. The few tactical successes, mainly in the southern sector where Montauban and Mametz had been captured, were overshadowed by the comprehensive failure along most of the front. The German second line remained intact and unbreached. The enemy's reserves had not been committed to counterattacks, suggesting that they remained confident in their defensive positions. The implications extended far beyond military considerations. Britain had committed the flower of its youth to this offensive, men who represented the future of their communities and the nation itself. Teachers and lawyers, miners and clerks, athletes and artists lay dead or dying in the French countryside. The social fabric of countless communities had been torn apart in a single day of fighting. News of the casualties would take days to reach Britain, filtered through military censors who struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Initial reports spoke vaguely of heavy fighting and determined resistance, euphemisms that concealed the truth from families anxiously awaiting word of their loved ones. When the casualty lists finally appeared in local newspapers, entire communities would be plunged into mourning. The German defenders, having survived the greatest bombardment in military history and repulsed the largest infantry assault they had ever faced, began to assess their own situation. Their losses, while significant, paled in comparison to British casualties. Estimates suggest that German forces suffered between 10 and 12,000 casualties during the first day, a fraction of the British total. More importantly, their defensive positions remained largely intact. German commanders recognized that they had achieved a tremendous tactical victory, but they also understood that this was likely only the beginning. British determination and resources were far from exhausted. The failed assault of July 1st would almost certainly be followed by renewed attacks as British commanders sought to justify the enormous sacrifice of the opening day. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the sounds of combat gradually diminished. The machine guns fell silent, their barrels cooling in the night air. Artillery fire became sporadic as both sides conserved ammunition and tended to their wounded. But the moans and cries of injured men continued through the night, a haunting reminder of the day's carnage that would echo in the memories of survivors for decades to come. The Battle of the Somme was far from over. What had begun as a single day's assault would stretch on for months, consuming armies and reshaping the nature of warfare itself. But July 1st, 1916, would forever stand apart as a day when innocents died alongside the volunteers who had answered their country's call. The bloodiest day in British military history had ended, but its consequences would reverberate through generations yet unborn. The aftermath of that terrible first day unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe across the British Isles. Telegraph wires hummed with coded messages that would soon translate into personal tragedies in countless homes. Military censors worked frantically to soften the brutal reality, but no amount of careful wording could disguise the magnitude of what had occurred. The phrase, "heavy casualties," appeared in newspapers across Britain, a euphemism that would soon give way to the stark mathematics of loss. In the War Office, clerks began the grim task of compiling casualty lists that stretched longer than anyone had imagined possible. Names that had been written in regimental rolls with pride just hours before now appeared on different lists entirely. The dead, the wounded, the missing. Each name represented not just a soldier, but a son, a father, a brother whose absence would leave an unfillable void in families across the nation. The Pals battalions, which had marched to war with such optimism, now revealed the terrible flaw in their design. When the Accrington Pals suffered their devastating losses, It meant that nearly every family in that Lancashire town faced personal tragedy. The same streets that had celebrated the departure of their local heroes now prepared for a grief that would touch every household. Mill workers, shopkeepers, teachers, clerks, all had answered the call together, and all had fallen together. Similar scenes played out across Britain as communities that had sent their young men to war in organized groups now faced concentrated devastation. In Grimsby, the fishing industry lost an entire generation in a single morning. In Sheffield, whole neighborhoods found themselves without the young men who had formed football teams and worked in the steel mills. The social bonds that had created the Pals battalions now became channels through which collective mourning would flow. July 1st, 1916, stands as a monument to human courage and the tragic cost of military miscalculation. 60,000 casualties in a single day, a number that transcends statistics to become a testament to sacrifice. The Pals battalions, bound by friendship and community, demonstrated that the strongest bonds of brotherhood could not shield against the brutal realities of modern warfare. Their legacy reminds us that behind every great historical tragedy lie countless personal stories of loss, heroism, and the price of freedom.